Sensor Officer Trill Vashka had run the same diagnostic 4 times before she finally worked up the nerve to interrupt Fleet Marshal Orrin Kade's morning briefing. "Marshal, I need you to look at this." Kade, commander of the Xanathi Imperium's 3rd Border Fleet, glanced up from the tactical display with the mild irritation of a man who had spent 30 years commanding one of the most powerful naval forces in the Eastern Spiral Arm, and had very little patience for interruptions that turned out to be sensor glitches. "This had better be significant, Vashka." "It is, Marshal. We're tracking an unidentified vessel approaching the Kethrani border corridor. Configuration doesn't match anything in the Imperial threat database. Not Kethrani design, not Voss collective, not anything cross-referenced against 40 years of recorded contact with any known spacefaring civilization." Kade pulled up the sensor feed himself, and for the first time in a career defined by unshakable composure, felt something genuinely unfamiliar settle into his chest. The vessel on his screen was small. Barely 200 meters, a fraction of the size of even a modest Imperial escort cruiser. Its hull geometry made no sense according to any naval architecture principle Kade had ever studied. Asymmetrical, seemingly designed with no regard for the elegant, functional symmetry every spacefaring species in the known galaxy had independently converged upon over centuries of shipbuilding. Its propulsion signature registered as something his analysts flagged, almost apologetically, as inconsistent with known physics models. "Species designation?" Kade asked. "Working on it now, Marshal. Preliminary translation of intercepted communications suggests the crew self-identifies as human. Point of origin, a system designated Sol, roughly 400 light-years beyond our current map territory." Kade stared at the readout for a long moment. "I've never heard of them. Neither has anyone else, Marshal. That's what concerns me." The Xanathi Imperium had spent 4,000 years cataloging every spacefaring civilization within reach of its extensive sensor networks, building what its own historians proudly described as the most complete record of galactic life ever assembled by a single species. 41 distinct civilizations, their capabilities, their weaknesses, their military doctrines, all of it meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and used to inform an expansion policy that had, over 4 millennia, brought nearly a third of the known galaxy under Imperial administration. Humanity, according to every record the Imperium possessed, did not exist. That absence troubled Fleet Marshal Kade considerably more than the ship's strange design. An advanced species simply appearing, seemingly from nowhere, at the very edge of contested Imperial territory represented either a catastrophic gap in 4,000 years of intelligence gathering, or something considerably stranger. A civilization that had developed in complete, deliberate isolation from the broader currents of galactic contact that connected every other known species to at least a handful of neighbors. "Bring the vessel in for standard identification protocol," Kade ordered. "I want a full technical assessment before we determine how to proceed." What followed, over the next several hours, would become one of the most extensively analyzed first contact encounters in Imperial military history. Not because of any hostile engagement, but because of the sheer, mounting strangeness of everything the Imperium's analysts uncovered as they studied the human vessel's design. "Marshal, this doesn't make sense," reported Chief Engineer Dessa Corin, presenting her preliminary findings with visible unease. "Their hull materials incorporate a composite lattice structure we've never encountered, stronger than anything in our own database, relative to its mass, but manufactured using processes that appear almost primitive by comparison to their end result. It's as though this species solved certain engineering problems in a completely different order than every other civilization we've ever studied. Death, arriving at solutions that shouldn't be reachable without first developing the intermediate technologies we'd expect to see. Explain that more plainly, Corin. Every species we've catalogued, Marshal, including our own, developed spaceflight technology along broadly similar paths. Chemical propulsion, then fusion, then increasingly refined energy-based systems, each stage building logically on the one before it, because that's simply how physics and engineering constraints shape technological development. This vessel's systems don't follow that pattern. it's as if they arrived at some of the most advanced propulsion and materials, science, the galaxy. Through a completely different sequence of discoveries, one that doesn't match any developmental model we've ever observed. The human vessel, once brought into Imperial-controlled space, for what Kade's superiors had authorized as a formal diplomatic assessment, identified itself simply as the Wanderer, crewed by a small scientific and diplomatic delegation led by Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose calm, measured demeanor, throughout the encounter, did little to ease the mounting unease among the Imperial officers assigned to study her ship. Your vessel's capabilities are unusual, Dr. Vasquez, Kade said, during the formal proceedings held aboard his own flagship, the Zenith's Authority. Our engineers have struggled to reconcile its technical specifications with any established model of technological development we've encountered across 4,000 years of contact with other civilizations. Vasquez considered the observation with the faint, knowing patience of someone who had clearly anticipated this exact reaction. Humanity's path to the stars didn't look like most civilizations. Fleet Marshal, we spent the better part of a century developing conventional rocketry and orbital technology. Much like I understand many species do. But roughly 40 years ago, our physicists made a breakthrough in a field of theoretical research. Most other civilizations, from what I understand of your own history, generally consider a dead end, manipulating spacetime curvature at extremely small scales, using principles that don't require the kind of massive energy expenditure most conventional propulsion theories assume is necessary. A dead end, Kade repeated. You're suggesting the rest of the galaxy abandoned research that humanity pursued to a successful conclusion. I'm suggesting, Vasquez said, that most civilizations, once they find a propulsion and engineering path that works reliably, tend to refine that path, rather than continue exploring alternatives that initially appear less efficient. Humanity has always had something of a stubborn streak about continuing to explore ideas other people have already decided aren't worth pursuing. In this particular case, that stubbornness happened to pay off in ways that apparently look quite strange from the outside. It was an explanation that satisfied precisely none of the Imperial engineers studying the Wanderer systems, and one that would continue to trouble Fleet Marshal Kade considerably in the days that followed. As deeper analysis of the vessel's capabilities revealed implications considerably more significant than an unusual engineering pathway, the deeper unease within Imperial Command had been crystallized 3 days into the Wanderer's presence in Zenathi territory, when a routine defense exercise. Standard practice whenever an unfamiliar vessel remained within Imperial space for extended study, produced results that sent Fleet Marshal Kade directly to Imperial High Command, with an urgency his superiors had rarely seen from him in 30 years of service. We conducted a standard simulated engagement scenario, Kade reported to the assembled Imperial War Council, presenting data that had already been independently verified by 3 separate analysis teams. Nothing hostile, simply a controlled test of the Wanderer's defensive response protocols, conducted with the full knowledge and cooperation of Dr. Vasquez's delegation. What we discovered is that the vessel's shielding technology operates on principles our own to defensive systems have no established countermeasure for. In a genuine engagement scenario, our analysis suggests a single vessel of the Wanderer's design, scaled to full military specification, could withstand sustained fire from an entire Imperial strike group considerably longer than any vessel currently in our own fleet. The silence that followed in the War Council chamber carried the particular weight of an empire, confronting, for the first time in centuries, the possibility that its carefully cultivated sense of technological supremacy across the known galaxy might not be as secure as 4,000 years of uncontested expansion had led it to believe. You're telling us, said Grand Admiral Yessa Thorne, presiding over the council, that a single, unarmed diplomatic vessel, from a previously unknown civilization, possesses defensive capabilities superior to our own frontline military fleet. I'm telling you, Grand Admiral, that our own analysis cannot fully explain how this is possible, which concerns me considerably more than the capability gap itself. Kade said, every technological advantage we've encountered from other similar civilizations across 4,000 years of contact has come with an underlying logic our own scientists could eventually reverse engineer, given sufficient time and captured technology. This is different. Our engineers have had full, cooperative access to the Wanderer systems for 3 days, and we still cannot fully explain the underlying physics of how their shielding functions. It simply works, according to principles that don't align cleanly with our own understanding of the universe's fundamental constraints. The formal diplomatic proceedings that followed, conducted over the subsequent 2 weeks between Dr. Vasquez's delegation and the highest levels of Imperial leadership, ultimately produced a result that would reshape the Xanathi Imperium's entire strategic posture toward the unexplored regions beyond its mapped territory, rather than the swift, confident assertion of dominance that had characterized the Imperium's approach to every previous first contact across 4,000 years of expansion. Grand Admiral Thorne found herself, for the first time in her considerable career, recommending an entirely different diplomatic posture. We have spent 4,000 years operating from the assumption that our technological development represents something close to the ceiling of what's achievable within known physical law. Thorne told the assembled War Council, in the final session addressing humanity's unexpected arrival. This single vessel, crewed by a species we had no prior knowledge of, has demonstrated capabilities that suggest our assumption was, at best, considerably premature. I recommend we approach any further contact with humanity, not from a position of established, imperial authority, but with the genuine caution appropriate to encountering a civilization whose true capabilities we do not yet fully understand. Dr. Vasquez, receiving word of the Imperium's shift toward a more cautious, respectful diplomatic posture, offered her own private reflection to the small crew of the Wanderer. As their vessel prepared for the long journey home, they spent 4,000 years believing they understood the shape of everything possible in this part of the galaxy, she told her crew. It's a strange thing, watching an empire that old realize, in the span of 2 weeks, that the universe is considerably larger and stranger than even 4 millennia of careful cataloging could fully capture. I imagine it isn't an easy thing for a civilization that confident to sit with. In the years that followed, the Xanathi Imperium's contact with humanity became the subject of extensive study within Imperial military academies, less for any conflict that emerged between the two civilizations. Remarkably, none ever did. Than for the simple, unsettling lesson its senior commanders had drawn from those tense weeks of encounter, that an empire's confidence in the completeness of its own knowledge is only ever as strong as the last unknown civilization it hasn't yet met. Fleet Marshal Orrin Kade, reflecting years later on the encounter that had defined the final chapter of his long naval career, offered what would become the most frequently quoted assessment of the entire episode. We looked at that ship and told ourselves it couldn't possibly be what our instruments were showing us because everything we thought we knew about how civilizations develop said it shouldn't exist. He said, but the universe was never obligated to develop according to the patterns we'd catalogued. We just hadn't met anyone yet who proved that to us directly. Humanity did, and I don't think the Imperium has looked at the stars quite the same way since. Far beyond the borders of Xanathi territory, humanity's slow, quiet expansion into the wider galaxy continued much as it always had. Not through conquest, not through overwhelming displays of force, but through the same stubborn, patient curiosity that had once led a small, isolated species to keep pursuing ideas everyone else had long since decided weren't worth the trouble, until those ideas quietly, unexpectedly, changed everything anyone thought they understood about what was possible among the stars. Word of the Wanderer encounter eventually reached the handful of other civilizations connected to the Xanathi Imperium's diplomatic sphere, carried through official channels that Grand Admiral Thorne had insisted remain candid rather than sanitized for the sake of imperial pride. Several of those civilizations, long accustomed to viewing the Imperium as the unquestioned, technological benchmark of their region of space, found themselves recalibrating their own assumptions in turn. Sending quiet inquiries toward Seoul in the years that followed, each one met by Dr. Vasquez's small diplomatic corps, with the same unhurried, deliberate patience that had defined humanity's approach to the stars. From the very beginning, Dr. Vasquez herself continued leading humanity's outward diplomatic missions for another 2 decades, becoming, almost by accident, one of the most recognized human faces among the dozen or so civilizations that eventually established formal contact with Earth. She was fond of telling new recruits, joining her delegation, the same story each time, about a fleet marshal on the other side of a negotiating table who simply could not accept, at first, that the ship in front of him was real. He kept looking at the data and saying it couldn't be a human warship. She would tell them, because everything in his training told him it shouldn't exist. And I think that's really the lesson worth remembering, whenever we meet someone new out there. It's never really about how big your fleet is, or how old your empire is. It's about staying curious enough, for long enough, that you're still capable of being surprised by what the universe has left for someone else to discover first.